So Beowulf and his men have landed on the shores of Denmark, and they are greeted by a guard, a coast guard, whose job is to sit there and watch out for armed raiders coming to shore. And here is this boat with Beowulf, this big mighty guy, and 14 of his comrades in arms, all very heavily armed, and coming ashore. And he is somewhat concerned about this. This is life and death. His job is to repel raiders, or at least warn warn the other troops of them coming in. So suddenly this party of men come storming ashore, and they're very concerned about this. And so he challenges them. He says, so now before you fare inland as interlopers, unwanted people coming to you, strangers, foreigners, I have to be informed about who you are and where you hail from. Outsiders from across the water, I'll say it again, the sooner you tell where you come from and why, the better. Again, this is a far cry from Xenia. This is tribal instincts kicking in. They don't like foreigners coming in. They're concerned that if you're coming, you're going to attack us. That is that inherent distrust. And Beowulf's response is very interesting. Always look for how somebody makes an entrance, and this is Beowulf's first real entrance. He didn't get a lot of lines even as he was packing up and hearing back home in Geekland. Now he's given a real scene to play out, and there's some very high drama playing out. And I particularly like, as anybody who's a lover of literature and writing in general, has to love that line that says, the leader of the troop unlocked his word hoard. Not, said something, anybody can say something, but to unlock your word hoard is something very, wow, that sounds cool. I just want to do it. But he delivers this nice little speech where he says, you have nothing to fear. We're here to help. He gives his heritage, talks about how his father was Ectheow, and he is noble in his own right. He says, we have arrived here on a great errand to the Lord of the Danes, and I believe, therefore, there should be nothing hidden or withheld between us, which is a cry for trust. He is saying, you have to trust me, which is a big step for a society based on tribal warfare and small bands of heavily armed crusaders wandering around from landing to landing, looking to sack and pillage and steal. So to have somebody coming and saying, "I don't want your stuff. I'm here to help you," that's hard to really swallow. That's hard to take, and the Coast Guard is a little bit concerned about that. He gets brought through several successive stages. The Coast Guard says, "Okay, you can go come ashore and go to our village, but I'm gonna escort you," which is a nice way of saying, I'm gonna keep my eye on you because I don't trust you. And they come in, they have another interview with another guard, and the same dynamic, very wary, very uncertain about these interlopers coming in, and Beowulf is trying to put them at ease. There is a cautious mistrust between them. But when he does get in to see Hrothgar, finally, Hrothgar recognizes him as a nobleman, as somebody who says, "Oh yeah, I know his father. I've heard stories. I'm familiar. So that kind of gives you a sense of the value of lineage in this culture, the value of aristocracy, the sense of the best people, so to speak. But these are all fairly standard ways of practicing diplomacy at the time, trying to come close to a recognition of humanity. Now he's no longer just, a potential marauder on our shores, an interloper. Now he's somebody that, okay, he has a human face to him. He has a context. There is a shared humanity there. We're both aristocrats. I knew your father. It's a sense of a bond. They're recognizing a bond between themselves. Um, but Hrothgar is also uh, very specific and narrow in his welcome. And he says, "Okay, it's great that you're here to help, uh, but there are a couple of dynamics going on here for Hrothgar. Hrothgar is the king; he's supposed to be the protector of his people, and his people have been getting savaged for a dozen years. And here is this outsider coming in who is going to play the hero, and that's hard for a king to take necessarily." But also, it is Hrothgar trying to come up with an understanding of why Beowulf would do this, and you know, how can I deal with this? How can I approach this from a diplomatic position? And so he says, um, I hope that he can help defend us from Grendel. This is my hope, and for his heroism, I will recompense him with a rich treasure. Um, his immediate reaction is to think of it in transactional terms once again, economic terms, really. If he comes and does this for me, I will pay him. Now, this is what he is, in fact, quite good for. This is what makes him a good king. This is what made his grandfather, Shield, a great king. The idea that he would give back, he had the loyalty of his men, and he was a good leader because he wouldn't hoard all of his money. He wouldn't take all of it. He would give some back. He would spread it around. Um, and this is considered a virtue here, the ability to share necessarily, to create common bonds through economic means, if nothing else. And this is a sign of him doing that. So they welcome him in, and um, after another somewhat tense interview, they welcome him in, and they say, "Okay, we're gonna have a party." Uh, um, there is a warning from from Hrothgar saying, time and again, when the goblets passed and the seasoned fighters get flushed with beer, they would pledge themselves to protect Herat and wait for Grendel with their whetted swords. But when dawn broke and day crept in over each empty, blood-spattered bench, the floor of the mead hall where they had feasted would be slick with slaughter. He's saying, well, talk is cheap. You're promising to help, and that's wonderful. And we're going to throw a nice little party. But, just so you know, people have done this before. They get a little rambunctious, a little drunk, perhaps. And that's exactly what brings out Grendel, the monster. Um, so they have this feast. They invite in some of the other noblemen and the knights of Hrothgar's court. There's a fair amount of verbal jousting. One guy who comes up and he's Unferth, uh, from where he crouched at the king's feet, which is kind of a, lowly position in one way. Um, Unferth, the king of the son of Eklaf, again, lineage, spoke contrary words. Beowulf's coming, his sea braving made him sick with envy. Envy is always a watchword here. It is a sign of division, a sign of resentment. You will remember that Grendel himself is a creature of resentment. He comes out at the first sounds of frivolity, of gaiety in the Great Hall, Hera, and he attacks out of a loneliness. They say repeatedly, he is attacking the people who are, to make it an after-school special. He is attacking all of the people who wouldn't invite him to the party. He is a lonely outcast, an exile from humanity, and he is roused to rage and vengeance out of envy and resentment at being outside that warmth, outside that community. So Unferth tells a story of, a story that you heard of Beowulf, and they had this great swimming contest, which in some translations comes off as a rowing contest, which honestly makes a little bit more sense. But it casts some question onto Beowulf and the qualities that he is celebrated for. But Beowulf corrects the record a little bit. Again, this is sort of a verbal jousting thing. This is a bunch of big drunk men, having a little bit of a pissing contest, essentially. Beowulf, Ecgtheow's son, replied, "Well, friend Unferth," and you just sense that he had just been sort of attacked. "Well, my friend, you can taste that. You have had your say about Brecca and me, but it was mostly beer that was doing the talking." Now that's a little bit of generous translation by Seamus Heaney, but the sense is there. It's, all right, fine. You had your say, I'm going to have mine. It's like a rap battle, for God's sakes. And he talks about how the truth is this. When the going was heavy in those high waves, I was the strongest swimmer of all. We'd been children together, he and Brecca, his friend, and grew up daring ourselves to outdo each other, boasting and urging each other to risk our lives on the sea. Which is an interesting calculation there. Unferth had characterized this relationship as being one of, somewhat hostile. And here Beowulf is saying, well, no, there was no hostility. We were, in fact, lifelong friends, and we egged each other on. We supported one another. We were there. We had a bond that helped us to be the very best people we could be. And throughout this little story, he couches it in the first person plural quite a few times. Shoulder to shoulder, we struggled on for 5 nights until the long flow and pitch of the waves, the perishing cold, night falling, and winds from the north drove us apart. The deep boiled up, and in its wallowing sent the sea brutes out. My armor helped me hold out. My hard-ring chainmail, hand forged and linked, a fine, close-fitting filigree of gold, kept me safe when some ocean creature pulled me to the bottom. And here you see a couple of things. One, it's pretty unrealistic to think that anybody would be able to fight in armor. Medieval armor is very, very heavy. This would have been, a sure ticket to drowning. But Put that aside. Another reason why it sounds more realistic that this was a boat race more than a swimming contest. But also in this, you see a kind of identification and celebration of weaponry. Armor and swords are very, very important to this culture. And your armor, especially if you are a knight or a warrior or whatever, this is an integral part of who you are. This is a deeply, deeply personal connection. Um, the mm, he has this fight with sea monsters. Uh, Interestingly, again, a sign of some humility in this, where he is playing the hero and casting himself as the hero, but still, he uh, he says his sword does the acting more than he does. My sword plunged, and the ordeal was over. Through my own hands, the fury of the battle had finished off the sea beast. First, it's his sword, his the outward extension of him, but still something that's not quite him. And then even there's a certain disassociation with my own hands, which is on one side claiming it for himself, but again, it's something almost foreign, the way he's looking at his hands as another weapon. Again, an extension, a connection to the weaponry, but still a slight dissociation from true credit for this act. Down a little further, however it occurred, my sword had killed 9 sea monsters. Again, sword getting the credit. Such night dangers and hard ordeals I have never heard of, nor of man more desolate in surging waves, but worn out as I was, I survived, came through with my life. The ocean lifted and laid me ashore. I landed safe on the coast of Finland, which seems to be more of a hero story of survival rather than conquest. He ends on the the reclaiming of land and his getting out of that situation rather than the big finish of killing the monsters. Just again, always look at how things begin and end, and he doesn't end on the killing of the monster or the conquest of that, but rather on simply the survival that he was able to uh, make happen. Was able to effectuate. Um, the this There's a lot of talking smack back and forth, a lot of drinking, which only fuels this. Drinking, weaponry, ego. You can see they're fairly recognizable signifiers of a very male culture, of a very martial culture, a very aggressive culture. And these are all embedded into this world that shouldn't necessarily be so foreign to us because they give a sense of a recognizable trait that we can see, among many people today, but also the prevalence of it suggests that, well, this is okay, yeah, they are all doing this, but this is a very rough world that they're in. They're in a world where people are just, going about quiet lives, and then one day a boat comes up the river and slaughters everybody. It is a very uncertain, very scary world out there. And these are all methods to cope with that. Significantly, the tension is settled most explicitly by the appearance of a woman, the queen, Hrothgar's wife, Wilthiow, comes out, and where'd that go? Where'd that go? Where'd that go? Wilthiow came in, Hrothgar's queen, observing the courtesies. The queen's job is to observe the courtesies in a world again of somewhat boisterous egos and, manly macho-ness. It is the woman who comes, and it is her job to be diplomatic, to bring the sides together. And you see this here. She observes a very kind of unifying protocol in the way she enters, because she enters, graciously saluted the men in the hall, then handed the cup. And she hands the cup around, first to Hrothgar. He's the king. This is his hall. This is only proper. But then she goes and offers the goblet to all ranks, or treating the household and assembled troop until it was Beowulf's turn to take it from her hand. With measured words, she welcomed the Geat and thanked God for granting her wish that a deliverer would she could believe in would arrive to ease their afflictions. She is going around and from one person to the next with this cup of wine or mead. It was a very rich wine that was common back then. She is essentially knitting together this very fractious group, one after the other, joining them together in a simple act of sipping from a cup, but also it's a diplomatic move. Drinking together has that diplomatic heritage, something that if if people cannot stop arguing or fighting, at least for a moment, they can have a simple drink in peace. Um, Her role throughout is consistent, but in ways very curious. Hrothgar steps in again, says, "Okay, thank you again. This is all for you." And he has a final line for Beowulf, saying, "Be on your mettle now. Keep in mind your fame. Beware of the enemy. There's nothing you wish for that won't be yours if you win through alive." Again, a transactional calculation there. If you do this for me, I will be very good for you. He's thinking in those terms, which is both a sign of benefit, because this is what makes a good king in his culture, but it is also this repetition of he's always coming back to this, and significantly, that is his last line. So again, beginnings and endings. If he's ending on this, this is significant. This is what the writer wants you to retain, that he is thinking in these terms. And so Hrothgar leaves. The party breaks up. Beowulf settles down, and everybody's gonna lie down and get a little rest, so they speak, or so they say. Grendel is on everybody's mind. Beowulf has promised that he will fight Beowulf one on one and without weapons, as a great hero would. And Beowulf suggests in a short line here that this isn't all just about showing off or being ego driven, but it's a sign, as he seems to think, of it's a reminder of the uncivilized nature of this beast. He, in Beowulf's words, it won't be a cutting edge I'll wield to mow him down easily as I might. He has no idea of the arts of war or of shield or sword play, although he does possess a wild strength. No weapons, therefore, for either this night. Weapons are civilization in this calculation. Weapons, therefore, are the opposite of the wild strength of Grendel. Beowulf is deeply associated with his weapons. So to have somebody who is so interlaced with armor and swords and the manufactured goods of mankind, uh, he sees Grendel as an outsider, as a monster, as an exile, as thoroughly barbaric. Um, and so that crystallizes the relationship between them. And so, you know, Grendel attacks. He comes, God cursed Grendel came greedily loping, which is a kind of a animalistic walk. You know, a lope is something that like a bear does, just heavy and kind of slow and lumberous. But greedy also suggests a kind of selfishness, an ego-driven quality to him. And Grendel enters the hall. Helix's kinsman, Beowulf, was keenly watching for the first move the monster would make, nor did the creature keep him waiting, but struck suddenly and started in. He grabbed and mauled a man on his bench, bit into his bone lappings, bolted down his blood, and gorged on him in lumps, leaving his body utterly lifeless, eaten up hand and foot. Which has a certain Odysseus in the Cyclops den ring to it to me. They they spring into action. Beowulf jumps up and they begin to fight. Beowulf grabs him and gets him in this iron grip, supposedly, and just clings to him. The hand grip harder than anything he had ever encountered in a man on the face of the earth. Every bone in his, Grendel's body, quailed and recoiled, but he could not escape. He was desperate to flee to his den and hide with the devil's litter, for in all of his days he had never been clamped or cornered like this. Get a sense of the superhuman strength of Beowulf. He is not a normal human being. He is more than that. He is a hero. The dread of the land was desperate to escape. He They're fighting, they're knocking stuff down. The whole hall is basically getting torn down. The hall clattered and hammered, but somehow survived the onslaught and kept standing. It was handsomely structured, a sturdy frame braced of the best of the blacksmith's work inside and out. They got to keep selling the hall. The story goes that as the pair struggled, rude benches were smashed and sprung up the air. Every time they reference the story goes that makes me think, oh, okay, yeah, that reminds me. This is all just a story. This isn't necessarily true. This is a story. It's a very careful frame that they're reminding you of there. They knock one another around. Grendel runs off, essentially to die. And then Beowulf has in his hand at the end of this little scene the great trophy of Grendel's arm. He has ripped the arm off of the monster and is holding it at the very end. A scene of great triumph for the hero. And so everybody celebrates, and they celebrate by coming together once again. Another sign of bonding, and they're celebrating Beowulf, but also celebrating the scourge being lifted from their land. So there's a curious two-part to it there. Beowulf is being brought further into the community. He is no longer necessarily the suspected interloper. He is brought in, and everybody gathers to join in, and that creates this great celebration of community. His fame spreads. The the narrator says Beowulf's doings were praised over and over again. Nowhere, they said, north or south, between the two seas or under the tall sky, On the broad earth, was there anyone better to raise a shield or to rule a kingdom? Hmm. Yet there was no laying of blame on their lord, the noble Hrothgar. He was a good king, which echoes what they said about Shield at the very beginning. He was a good king, which is very insistent. But when somebody's really trying to drive a point insistently like that, it makes me lean back a little, because here they seem to be a little bit cautious or a little bit wary of this rival suddenly being celebrated. Like, hey, yeah, he's a great hero, but our king who let us get slaughtered for 12 years or so, he's a good king. There's an uneasy relationship there. Um, they celebrate the best way they know, which is to bring in a storyteller, a carrier of tales, a traditional singer, deeply schooled in the lore of the past, and he comes in to sing a story, um, presumably about lore of the past, but they say this time he linked a new theme to a strict meter. So he's taking new material about Beowulf, presumably, and he is going to weave it together for this occasion, adapting and improvising somewhat. Um, and the story is actually about Sigmund, who is a famous Germanic hero. It's another hint at the Germanic history of these people, from their barbaric past. But it is also a story of family strife between an uncle and a nephew. We don't need to get into the specifics of it, but that theme of family division and hostility and resentment will be recurring throughout the rest of the play, or the poem rather. The Hrothgar is sitting there hosting the party, and well, he has to show up first. The light of day broke and kept brightening. Bands of retainers galloped in excitement to the gabled hall to see the marvel, and the king himself, guardian of the ring hoard, goodness in person, walked in majesty from the women's quarters. In a deeply macho society, he is coming from the women's quarters. You can make of that what you will, but it's a sign of him perhaps being a little soft or effeminate, possibly. With a numerous train attended by his queen and her crowd of maidens across to the mead hall. So he is leaving the realm of women and going with them to the mead hall, which is the realm of men. Again, there's a somewhat disparaging connotation to all of this. It seems like in this society he is being suggested as a little impotent, a little too womanly, perhaps, in comparison to this great hero. So there's, again, that curious tension that's building. And he shows up and he makes a speech. He makes a speech crediting God, largely. He, uh, he says, first and foremost, let the Almighty Father be thanked for this sight. Okay, yeah, that seems proper. I suffered a long harrowing by Grendel, but the heavenly shepherd can work his wonders always and everywhere. Okay, so again, crediting God. Not long since it seemed I would never be granted the slightest solace or relief. He's kind of playing the victim there. Um, from any of my burdens, the best of houses glittered and reeked and ran with blood, which he was failing to stop as king and protector of his people. This one worry outweighed all others. Again, the worry seems to be the focus here rather than the slaughter itself. The worry is on him. The slaughter is on everybody else, but his concern or his focus here is on the worry about it. So he is kind of playing the victim. A constant distress to counselors entrusted with defending the people's forts from assault by monsters and demons. But now a man, with the Lord's assistance, has accomplished something none of us could manage before now for all our efforts. He's reminding everybody that, well, yeah, I kept trying, but none of us could do it, but only him with the Lord's assistance. He's constantly qualifying and couching this in very specific terms. Um, so now, Beowulf, I adopt you in my heart as a dear son. So you see this, he finally gets to Beowulf, credits him by name, and says, in the next breath, or in the same breath even, I adopt you, which is an act of literal paternalism, of creating a bond. Certainly, this is a great diplomatic moment, but it is also one that has some fraught context in terms of a power struggle between these two. He is trying to clearly align himself with Beowulf, who is suddenly, in the very previous scenes, been celebrated somewhat as, a good potential king. Remember, Hrothgar is only there because he can distribute bounty among his people. There is a, this is a very violent time of history, and a king is just the person who can convince the most people to follow him at this point. So the idea of a hereditary transition is there, but it's very vulnerable to everybody just saying, no, I don't think we want to follow you, we want to follow him. He has to pay off everybody along the way to keep them loyal. And here, Hrothgar seems to be aware of that. Again, he is caught up in this transactional culture himself. Beowulf, son of Ecgtheow, spoke. We have gone through with a glorious endeavor and been much favored in this fight. We dared against the unknown. We, again, the plural, he is not necessarily hogging all the credit, even though it pretty much was just him. And we have been much favored. Again, credit to God, perhaps, maybe even to trying to extend a little credit to Hrothgar. He's being very humble here, saying, I couldn't have done it without the big guy. The Lord allowed it. My lock on him wasn't strong enough. He struggled fiercely and broke it ran, yet he bought his freedom at a high price, for he left his hand and arm and shoulder to show he has been here, a cold comfort for having come among us. Again, you can see this little ego breaking through a little. He wants to brag a little. There's that uncertainty that, well, he's trying to be very diplomatic, but at the same time, that ego is sort of striving, which again recalls Odysseus, who can't quite squelch the need for some recognition of his own heroism. They all sit and they all take their time at a feast in the hall. The benches filled with famous men who fell to with relish. Round upon round of mead was passed. Those powerful kinsmen, Hrothgar and Hrothulf, were in high spirits in the raftered hall. A sense of unity, a sense of coming together, a sense of celebration in being together, in being able to be together without the threat. The kinsmen are another significant moment there, because this is a sign of a family feud that was alluded to earlier. The shielding nation was not yet familiar, or inside Heorot there was nothing but friendship. The shielding nation was not yet familiar with feud and betrayal, which is a sign of Hrothgar and his nephew, who will basically go to war later in history than this moment. So again, everybody in the audience hearing this story told would know this, would have it in, like, their collective cultural awareness. But here they don't know it yet. So it's this sense of foreboding doom just around the corner. That even this happy scene has this haunting underlay of dissension and uh, fratricide, honestly, of war between family members, which is another. The family can be seen as a stand-in or a metaphor for a whole people or a tribe in this case. Um, but they give away gifts. There's, Beowulf is just getting gifts upon gifts upon gifts. The they sing and they have another song, the saga of Finn and her sons, which is really a story of uh, family bonds and personal loss. It begins, Hildebert had little cause to credit Jude's son and brother. She lost them both on the battlefield. So this Hildebert is a woman, and here you get a sense of, again, beginnings and endings. It's beginning on a sign of a woman's loss, a woman's loss of her son and her brother because they had gone to war. Family division, hostility, resentment over usually the distribution of power and wealth, um, in opposition to the tradition of paying out and giving back your wealth, sharing. Um, they hear this lovely story, which goes on for quite a while, and who comes out right after that? But Wealthial again, another woman, another mother. And she sits, Wealthial came to sit in her gold crown between two good men, uncle and nephew, each of whom still trusted the other. She sits between her husband and nephew, and they still trust each other. Again, that sense of the foreboding future. But she sits between them. Like she went between everybody in the party earlier with the cup, she sits between them to try and pull them together. Women are here a civilizing force. They are a uniting force. It is her job as the woman to bring these fractious elements together and keep them from fighting. After this story of, a woman's loss and the catastrophe that comes from resentment, she is there trying to quell any family division, any dissension, and keep everybody together. It's a classic mom role, and this is the role that she is there to play. It is a role of the woman as the unifier. It is a very domesticated role in sharp contrast to the warring male world. The queen spoke, "Enjoy this drink, my most generous lord. Raise up your goblet, entertain the Geats duly and gently. Discourse with them, be open-handed, be generous, happy, and fond. Relish their company, but recollect as well all of the boons that have been bestowed on you. Remember everything that you have been given so that you will be inspired to give back. Do not create dissension by being greedy." Grendel was greedily loping. She is saying, give back, give out. She also proposes a certain deal. Uh, she wants her sons are there. She turned then to the bench where her boys sat, Hrethric and Hrothmund, with other noble sons, all the youth together, always sign togetherness. And that good man, Beowulf the Geat, sat between the brothers. So now he is right there. And she comes and says, you know, Beowulf, as a sign of our unity now as peoples, the friendship, our alliance between our nations. I'm going to send my boys to you in Geatland, where you can use them as your aides, your knights, your whatever. Basically, she is sending them away to college. There were no colleges at the time, but it was fairly common for um, families, royal families, to send their sons to live with other royal families in other countries, where they can get a sense of how to be a king. They can learn at the feet of a different king, watching a different king, and so they learn a little something outside of the immediate family home, where their mother might coddle them a little bit, where all the servants are going to be deferring to them a little bit too much. This is, in a sense, sending them out into the world to try and help them. But that's a sign, again, of a kind of faith, a kind of trust that we have a common bond now. Now I'm going to send my sons with you. In essence, we are going to share our families. We are going to become one, which is a fairly radical break in the notion of tribalism. Conventional, yes, for this time, but it's still a sign that it is that these two nations, who have a history of antagonism to one another, that these two peoples are creating a bond, which is what Wealthy Owl does. Uh, but all of the coming together, all of the celebration, all of the partying, of course, leads to or initiates another disaster. We've had this story of Hildeburl, a mother who loses a son. We have the story of Wealthy Owl coming in and playing her role as a mother, both in knitting together the society that she is a mother figure to, but also in caretaking for her own individual sons. So we get these two portraits of motherhood in very quick succession. And now we have a third. Grendel's mother is upset that her son was slaughtered. You could say understandable. The uh, the monster that is her mom, that is Grendel's mom, is unnamed. We only have that identifier of Grendel's mother. The individuality is entirely linked to him, to the original monster, to Grendel, and she is almost more bestial than he is in certain ways. Grendel's mother, monstrous Hellbride, brooded on her wrongs, resentment, brooded on her wrongs. Again, you can introduce her with any number of descriptors, but just saying that, her initial entrance is about her brooding on her wrongs, how she is a victim, how she wants to lash out at the world that has wronged her. Um, that's dramatic. they they couch her in very emotional terms, which is both appealing and horrifying in almost equal measure. The Helldam was in a panic, desperate to get out, in mortal terror the moment she was found. She had pounced and taken one of the retainers in a tight hold, then headed for the fen to Hrothgar. This man was the most beloved of the friends he trusted between the two seas. Um, she was an enemy of mankind, outcast from all sweetness. Uh, now his mother sallied forth. No, that was Grendel, sorry. Now his mother sallied forth on a savage journey, grief racked and ravenous, desperate for revenge, which is a kind of, well, it's a sign of interiority. She has, something going on inside of her that's very painful, but also just a very emotional dimension to this character. Grendel was presented outside of the context of he seemed to be acting out of a sense of inner loneliness. You didn't get that much dwelling on his inner state beyond that. Here, this seems to be a little bit more focused, um, but it is also a very emotional, hysterical dimension to her. And the hysterical nature of it is significant because it's another portrait of women being emotional, irrational, hysterical, that they cannot be dealt with, they cannot be trusted. They are an even more dangerous enemy than the original monster. Um, and so she attacks and she kills what is Hrothgar's best friend, supposedly, in the hall. And the by killing Hrothgar's friend, it also ups the emotional toll, the stakes of the conflict, because now Hrothgar, seemed bothered by the years of Grendel attacking and killing all of his men, but he didn't. None of them were identified by name. None of them seemed to have any individual value to him. It was just, oh yeah, the monster came and took more of my men. But now here, it's personal. This time it's personal. It's a sense of Hrothgar's uh, deeper loss and greater emotional involvement now. There is, however, in this a a lingering sense, and this might be, more of a modern interpretation of it. But Grendel's mother is is said to be dwelling somewhat initially. Beowulf was aware earlier, after the award of the treasure, the Geat had been given another lodging. There, he finds out, oh my God, something happened when I wasn't there. There was great uproar in Heorot. She had snatched their trophy, Grendel's bloodied hand, the severed arm that Beowulf had ripped off and they had nailed essentially up on the wall. Um, it was a fresh blow to the afflicted one. The bargain was hard, both parties having to pay with the lives of friends. But something in that image of Grendel's mother attacking in vengeance and then uh, carrying away the severed arm of her son. Uh, there is something recognizable there. That's a small moment of some empathy where you're cracking in and you're remembering. Yeah, she's not just a monster; she's a mother, Grendel's mother. That relationship is the core of her identity. It's the only name we know her by. And that relationship is recurrent throughout the mother role. We've just been given that little warm up of mother stories, and now we're seeing, she lost her son. Of course, in the story they heard, Hildeborough lost her son, and they both go about uh, they both react to this in different ways. And Wilthiow, in essence, is facing the prospect of family dissension causing more violence, and the risk of losing her sons. Um, you see in this though the the quandary of a mother who lost her son and what is the proper way to react, because here we get at the core between a barbaric world and perhaps a civilized world, where in the barbaric world there was the concept of vergeld, where you could pay someone to if you killed a member of a different tribe, that tribe has the right to come to your tribe and say, okay, we want compensation. It can be money, as in guild, money, gold, give us some gold, and we'll settle on a price, and we'll call fair's fair, or we will kill you, or one of your tribe. And that's how tribal warfare tends to work. That's what they were trying to get away from, though. That sense of retribution. Um, but getting to a new version of that takes a new understanding, a new philosophical frame for how to view justice. And what's coming in at this time, what is sort of interlaid throughout all of this, is the slow weaving in to this barbaric world of Christian principles and the idea of forgiveness and brotherly bonds outside of tribal distinctions and forgiveness. The story of Christ begins, or rather ends in a way, when a mother loses a son. The titular mother in Christianity is the Virgin Mary, who loses her son. And we don't know an awful lot from the scriptures about her, but the tradition has it is that she was forgiving. She didn't let the anger and resentment and envy consume her. So we see that alternative just lingering in the background here. It's never made explicit. We're never told that, this is Mary lurking in the background, but it's there. It's a theme. Hrothgar's consumed with his own now more personal guilt, or not guilt, but grief, and that drives him to want greater vengeance. He says, "Okay, we have to get vengeance. Retributive justice is what he knows." And so he gets Beowulf to go out. Beowulf finds her at in these watery depths. Psychologists for quite some time have gone on about how well the woman monster resides in this dark and murky swamp with deep water. Swamps usually have fairly shallow water. This, for some reason, has fairly deep water. And psychologists have gone crazy with the associations of that. But honestly, the the traditions go back. I mean, uh, you can go back to Tiamat and the river god meeting the ocean, and the ocean is the woman. The depths, the mystery of the depths, the that you cannot see to the bottom of, that are too destructive in potential, although placid on the surface often. Um, there are associations all over the place, but of course that's where she's hiding. That's where Beowulf tracks her down. Um, Down they plunged, lashing in anger, and a loud call as the battle bugle. Um, he's got a special. He's got his weapons. Let's see. I'm trying to see what's good here. Um, the description of uh, the description of their fight, Beowulf's and Grendel's mother, is really it's something quite extraordinary. Uh, Quickly, the one who had haunted these waters, who had scavenged and gone her gluttonous rounds for 100 seasons, sensed a human observing her outlandish lair from above. So she lunged and clutched and managed to catch him in her brutal grip. But his body, for all that, remained unscathed. The mesh of his chainmail saved him on the outside. Her savage talons failed to rip at the web of his war shirt. He cannot be penetrated. Hmm. There is a sense of, again, the weaponry is, the armor is very important, but it is her talons that cannot pierce the armor into his flesh. Interesting little detail to include. Then when she touched bottom, that wolfish swimmer carried the ring-mailed prince to her court, so that for all his carriage he could never use the weapons he carried, and a bewildering horde came at him from the depths, droves of sea beasts who attacked with tusks and tore at his chainmail in a ghastly onslaught. The gallant man could see that he had entered some hellish turn-hole, and yet the water there did not work against him, because the hull roofing held off the force of the current. Then he saw the firelight, a gleam and flare up, a glimmer of brightness. They're in this underground cavern, essentially. They are entirely in her realm. And he is kind of a stranger among them. The hero observed that the swamp thing from hell, the Tarn hag, in all her terrible strength, then heaved his war sword and swung his arm. The decorated blade came down ringing and singed on her head, but he soon found his battle torch extinguished. Battle torch extinguished. The shining blade refused to bite. He can't stab her. His sword is useless. He cannot penetrate her flesh with his sword. It spared her and failed the man in his need. It had gone through many a hand-to-hand fight and hewed the armor and helmets of the Dune, but here at last the fabulous powers of that heirloom failed. They had made such a big deal about this sword. He had it on loan from Unferth, and it has this great history of heroes associated with it, because a weapon is also something that brings people together. It unites generations because it is passed down the line. It brings people together. But it is also a sword. Read into that what you will. They fight more. So must a man do who intends to gain enduring glory in a combat. Life doesn't cost him a thought. Heroic notions of it. The sure-footed fighter felt daunted. The strongest of warriors stumbled and fell, so she pounced on him and pulled out a broad, whetted knife. Ooh. Now she could avenge her only child, a broad, whetted knife, a sharp, big sword to pierce his flesh. But the mesh of chainmail on Beowulf's shoulder shielded his life, turned the edge and tip of the blade. Again, a blade that cannot bite into the flesh, cannot pierce. The son of Ecgtheow would have surely perished, and the Geats lost their warrior under the wide earth, had not the strong links and the locks of his war gear not helped to save him. Holy God decided the victory. It was easy for the Lord, the ruler of heaven, to redress the balance once Beowulf got back on his feet. Once again, his sword. But he sees another sword. He is discarded as worthless. Her knife doesn't seem to be working for her even, but he sees a sword on her wall, a trophy from perhaps another warrior that she had stolen, a sword in her armory, an ancient heirloom from the days of giants, an ideal weapon, one that any warrior would envy, but so huge and heavy in itself, only Beowulf could wield it in battle. So the Shielding's hero, hard-pressed and enraged, took a firm hold of the hilt and swung the blade in an arc, a resolute blow that bit deep into her neck bone and severed it entirely, toppling the doomed house of her flesh. She fell to the floor. The sword dripped blood. The swordsman was elated. He has to steal her sword in order to do the deed. It's after this image of her pouncing on him, and in essence, almost in an image of rape. Now he has to borrow her sword. His manly accoutrement of his own sword is not up to the task, so he has to borrow hers, and it's only through that he can do this, that he can finally kill the monster. There is so much there that I'm just honestly not going there. He sees her, he cuts off the head of the monster, drags it back to shore. He sees as he goes that the monster, Grendel's mother, was in fact sitting on a large treasure trove, a hoard, as it were. The geek captain saw treasure in abundance, but carried no spoils from those quarters except for the head and the inlaid hilt embossed with jewels. Its blade had melted, and the scroll work on it burned. So scalding was the blood of the poisonous fiend who had perished there. So he takes the sword, but he leaves all of this other stuff. She was sitting there on a hoard of treasure, valuables, the same kinds of treasure that ostensibly these tribal raiders would steal from a village or a kingdom when they came ashore. The same kind of treasure that the kings of these raiders would pay back to people. So while Hrothgar, for instance, has a reputation for always paying back for the service he receives from his people, and thus creating loyalty and a bond between them, Grendel's mother is a hoarder. She doesn't share. She just collects it for no reason whatsoever. I mean, she's a monster, and she has no way to spend it. It's purely non-economic means. It's just hoarding for the sake of hoarding, which in itself is a very unsocial activity. It's just taking and keeping and not creating anything of human value with it. It's just money that sits there. And and you stuff your all your bills into your mattress at night, and you don't do anything with it. It doesn't. It just sits there. It's a sense of isolation, of exile, of barbarianism, and this is all fixed on Grendel's mother right here, very significantly. The author is continually pointing out, I would say, that this is the way you don't want to be, like Grendel's mother, who is a very negative character, not social in any way. The only bond she recognizes is with her son, and when she loses that, she overreacts and goes on a destructive rampage. If she had perhaps friends, she could have gotten through the grief. You could argue, but it is a recurrent sign that this poem is about the ability to transcend personal resentment and adopt a more uh, humanistic approach to the world, where you recognize human qualities and value human interaction beyond just the simple relationships of a single family, but creating external relationships with other families. And that's kind of what Herat was meant to do, or at least it was meant to bring together the broader family of Hrothgar's men and kingdom, and extend out its fame for all of that. But by doing that, it becomes a beacon for other people to want to see. One of the reasons that Beowulf shows up is because he hears of the plight of this great hall over in among the Danes, and he is drawn to that like everybody else, because if you build it, they will come. They built Herat. They built this civilization that is meant to bring people together, and they're coming. Maybe more than they originally intended. So they were very concerned when Beowulf came ashore. But this beacon is pulsing in the world now, and it is dragging people to them. Herat means heart once again, and the heart of Christ is a very important image in Christian iconography. And here you see all of these people nudging themselves towards this new belief system, this new understanding, this new imperative that we have to leave our barbaric ways behind. It is a dead end built on resentment and isolation and exile. We need to embrace a new frame for the world. And that was happening as Christianity was rolling over the English nation.